Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Wandering Road podcast. I'm your host Chris, alongside my co-host Dean, and for today's episode, we're going to be sticking around in the UK for today's topic. Our previous topic, before we had a couple of guest episodes for y'all, we talked about the Dawdleston messages, if you recall that one, Dean, where this guy was claiming back in 1984 he was getting messages on his, well, not connected to a network computer. But for today's episode, we are going back to the late 1970s with the Enfield Poltergeist encounter, or also known as the Enfield haunting. If you've heard of this before, or this sounds familiar to you, this was the main plot of the Conjuring 2 movie, in which in that universe, the Warrens in that movie, they go over to England to investigate this haunting situation of a mom and her, I believe it's 3 kids or
Yep.
so, where they're plagued by this haunting entity. In the film, it turns out to be a demon. As we talk through this case, we'll kind of decipher, like we normally do, whether we think certain things are legitimate, certain things are exaggerated, and then you'll get our final opinions on what we really think is going on.
First thing that stands out to me personally for this topic is this happened a while ago, right? And even if you're looking into the particular story as reported by the BBC, which is like, the British broadcasting channel, you would think, okay, they've done their due diligence. They were better postured in the last 20 years to really run down sources and information and stuff. So I think I would personally give a lot of credibility and weight to that particular article. If you're listening to this, you can totally look it up yourself too. It's like they're just type in BBC Enfield London poltergeist case or whatever, and you'll find it like at the top. But the thing that we want to emphasize for this particular coverage is like this topic is this happened in 1977, and one particular emphasis that somebody who was interviewed for this case, they basically said like, hey, listen, and this was a hindsight thing, like this happened after the fact, for like many years of reflection after the poltergeist supposedly was there at the house. This time in history, especially in British history, was particularly like unprecedented. They had an intense period of political and economic turmoil. There was a lot of like social angst into what was going on, like uncertainty. You had the Cold War, you had Vietnam raging at this time. So like it's really a time in history, human history, where there was just a lot of uncertainty, and that weighed psychologically on the people who were living in and around this area and in the world at this time, who were tied into global um, happenings like economics and political and all that stuff. So like I think that's important to frame what's going on before we go into the specific details.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, this takes place like either we're already in the Thatcher era or we're getting close to the Thatcher era. I think that Thatcher came into power as prime minister in like 78 or 79. So to put that into context as well, you brought up the turmoil and stuff, not only in the UK, but just in the world in general. It was a very tumultuous time. So to jump right into the story, the key players here are Peggy Hodgson, who's the single mother of 4 children. So I was incorrect earlier. I thought it was 3. I don't know why I thought it was 3. So it's Margaret, who is 13, Janet, who's 11, Johnny, who was 10, and Billy, who was 7. So they lived in a modest council house at 284 Green Street in Enfield, a borough in North London. So these strange occurrences began when Janet and Johnny started complaining to their mother that their beds started shaking. And on top of that, with the bed shaking and stuff, they started hearing strange knocking. They just started reporting increasingly bizarre activity, such as furniture moving on its own, knocking sounds echoing from the walls, chest of drawers sliding across the floor by itself, even when, Peggy tried to stop it. At one point, Peggy called the police, and upon arrival, a police officer witnessed the chair move across the room without any visible cause. She couldn't give an answer to what was going on, but the event was documented in the police report. So it was one of those situations where one of those rare cases where we have police involvement, right?
Dude, that's the fucking key to this whole discussion is so like we've talked so much in the past about situations like whether it's supernatural or cryptid or whatever, it's always like there's an air for the most part of like, well, this is debunkable for the most part. So there you go, credible witness, right? You have at least one, if not more, credible witnesses. The police officers, I would wager, didn't know the people who lived here. If you go to the actual street, which we'll talk about more in detail later, which I think is hilarious because if you type in the address of the Enfield house, it kind of looks like McGonagall should be popping into like her cat form. It just looked like a
McGonagall.
yeah, it's a quintessential Harry Potter England neighborhood, right? You have duplexes. It looks really quaint. It doesn't look malicious at all. It's not, all that stuff. So I think that's interesting because I know like you can go, well, it doesn't really matter what the area looks like. It's more about the energy and stuff. Well, at the same time, it really matters what the air and the atmosphere is. I think in my opinion. So I don't get a negative sense looking at the street or in the area in which they lived. But what does stand out to me is that this looks like a normal suburban London life. In other words, it could happen anywhere. If this was a situation in which there was some manipulation going on, like some misdirection or whatever, that's one thing. But when you start introducing the presence of a no kidding police force who doesn't have any equity in the average life of Londoners at this time directly. They're there to serve and protect, but they're not there to help people at an individual level. So even if this family was struggling financially, they were trying to find a way out of a terrible situation, by orchestrating some or fabricating some kind of story about poltergeist or whatever. Like that does not fit to me. So you have police officers who are supposed to be doing their job. There's no immediate connection to the family. So why in the world would the police officers report experiencing paranormal events? That's why this particular topic to me is fascinating and exciting to talk about because like we can totally tear it apart like anything else. But at the same
Right.
time, there are people involved like police officers who have no equity in saving or protecting the family. I think that's the most important thing to talk about before we go into particular detail. So I'll toss it back to you. I know that was kind of long, but that's just my general feeling about the situation.
The first line of help was she called the police. The police are like, look, I can't fucking help you. I have no idea. Peggy decides in her desperation, since the police couldn't help, nobody could explain what was going on, she decided to turn to the local press for help. So what did she do? She ended up contacting the Daily Mirror, which at the time was a very popular British tabloid newspaper. If you think about it, maybe her reasoning for doing this, she would hope that publicizing this would attract people that could possibly help her. And also, she probably wanted to have actual legitimate documentation that crazy shit was happening to her and her kids and that nobody was imagining things, nobody was hallucinating, and God forbid whatever this poltergeist or whatever this entity was started physically harming the kids. The worst thing that could happen is that she would get blamed for it, right? So I think this is kind of very intelligent on her part. Not to reach out to the press, like we've heard some situations, they reach out to the press because they want attention, they want everybody to focus on them and be like, look at me, look what's going on. This sounds like a real call for help. She gets in contact with the Daily Mirror. So they send over a reporter, they send over a photographer, and they send over a driver to investigate the house. So the team ends up staying in the house for several hours, didn't see anything unusual. But right on cue, as they're about to leave, they witnessed a series of loud bangs and objects being thrown across the room. So the photographer of the Daily Mirror managed to take a few pictures, and the team was so fucking freaked out that they decided to publish the story and continue covering the case. Of course, once the Daily Mirror started reporting on what was going on, the British media in general, it's going to gain traction on it because of the unusual nature of these events, combined with the fact that you had police officers involved, you have journalists involved, you have pictures involved, we have witnesses involved with Peggy and the children. This is a hot news story. When we get to the late 1970s, horror movies, they're starting to become popular. That whole genre is starting to become popular. In the late 70s, you have the Exorcist film, right? Everybody is flocking to that stuff. It just fits in with the public's fascination with the paranormal. Here's the thing that I think is really important. If you remember from the Dawdleston Messages episode that we did, the newspaper coverage or the media coverage attracted the attention of SPR and its investigators. And the main investigator that was heavily involved in this case is Maurice Grosse. Before I continue there, anything to add?
No, I think that's a pretty comprehensive initial look at it. The thing that I want to emphasize before we continue is that there are aspects to this situation that are debunkable, right? And
Oh,
we're going
100%.
to go we're going to go into more detail about it. Okay, so we don't shit on people per se, but we have had discussions in the past where say like the Warrens are involved, and if like listen, it doesn't matter if you're 51% towards the support for Warrens and 49% saying they could have been shysters. Doesn't matter. What matters is like nobody is saying that the Warrens are 100% legitimate in the same sense that this situation, like nobody's saying that this situation is 100% legitimate. There might have been a mix between emphasis on like infatuation or concentration on what was going on and bolstering by the media of like what they think was happening. Like maybe there's some kind of they're providing some kind of sense of support for what's happening, but there might have been some shysterness, like like there might have been some kind of like base, for lack of a term, just like saying things are happening when they're not happening.
And to talk about the Warrens real quick, I fall in the camp in the middle. I think they were
Yeah,
legitimate in what they were trying to do.
right.
I do think Lorraine was a psychic medium. She had capabilities. So 100% on that. Some of the cases, maybe if you get to a certain point, you're dealing with certain cases and, gaining popularity would be beneficial for you financially. I mean, I'm never going to knock anybody for trying to make a dime to live, we all
Right.
got to
Yeah,
earn a
yeah,
living. So not under no circumstance are we saying like, they're fucking
but
liars and
yeah.
cheats or anything like that. What we do like to point out is the timing of when certain investigators like to go to the media and make this public. But
Yeah,
with this
listen,
type of
wait,
situation,
hold on.
yeah,
Like, listen. Okay, I'm so sorry. This is
yeah, go
so
ahead.
important to say. This is so important to emphasize. If people out there wanted to embellish what was going on with particular situations, like we can bring up certain people who have risen to the tippy top of whatever news source or channel source you want to talk about, and like ghost haunting investigations, whatever, like, cryptid investigations like Bigfoot, there is a degree out there for sure of embellishment. I think that it's important to always be cognizant of that. Like, so there are plenty of situations in this world and this life where we have stories that people experience strange events, unexplainable events, and even so much so that if they experience it, like maybe there's really smart people who go through a certain situation or certain event and they're very articulate on what they went through, like, hey, listen, like I think it could be this and this, which is logical, but at the same time there are other aspects to this engagement or experience that are unexplainable. And so to me, that goes back to what you and I are trying to do with this podcast, which is like, we're not trying to talk we're not trying to talk shit up. Like, we're not trying to embellish stuff. We're trying to get after the actual fact of the nature, focusing on the people who go through these situations, who are not trying to like lift things up and trying to make explanations for something, for, for personal sake. It's like trying to understand what's actually going on. And so this is a weird case, right? So you have the Warrens involved, who might be shysters, but you said, like, Lorraine might have been clairvoyant, which I'm open to the idea on. But at the same time, they might have been coaxed as they went through their careers, emphasizing and bolstering all this stuff that they've been going through for money's sake. Who knows? But what matters is there isn't a degree in which the people involved, especially the psychonatural, or whatever you want to say, involved, like, they have some kind of degree of understanding or proof that these sort of things are going. At the same time, if you Google the photos of the Enfield Poltergeist situation, there's the opposite: the girl hovering above her bed, right? I've actually heard people who are professionals in photography say, no, like, it's very clear to me that she's physically jumping out of her bed. And the photo that's being taken is her on the descent back to the floor after jumping out of her bed, based off of where her hair is at, her posture's at, her dress, all that stuff. But at the same time, like, you have the police reports where the police are showing up, who are separate from these individual cases, and they're claiming shit's flying across the room. They're getting a weird sense while they're there. Like, it's such a hard case to approach, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Right. So let's jump right in and pick it up from when SPR get involved, right?
Okay.
So, like I said, Maurice Gross gets involved, and along with him is Guy Leon Playfair that gets involved as well.
Mhm.
So, Gross has a personal interest in this case because he ended up losing his daughter in a tragic accident. He's kind of in that situation where he wants to explore if there's a paranormal world, the afterlife, etc.
Mhm.
So, over the course of a year, Gross and Playfair end up documenting hundreds of unusual occurrences. So, we'll pick it up from the one you just talked about with the girl, quote unquote, levitating off her bed. So, Janet was reportedly seen levitating off her bed. And if you look at the photo, it seems like she might have jumped off her bed. Not really levitating, right?
Yeah.
Then there's multiple situations with voice phenomena where Janet starts speaking in a deep, gruff voice in which she claimed to be a man named Bill Wilkins, who had lived in that house and ended up dying in the house. His spirit remained there. Also, there's documentation of toys and household items flying across the room. Witnesses claim to have seen shadowy figures or hear voices within the house, but not being able to find the source of it. The investigators of SPR ended up using recorders, cameras, and notebooks to document the phenomenon. So you're talking about SPR, who's actually there witnessing everything. Gross himself claimed to have witnessed objects moving unaided, and even said that metal spoons had been twisted and furniture had been overturned. They're actually documenting this. SPR is there, and if you recall from Dottleston, SPR was involved as well. And in that situation, the folks involved that were being plagued by whatever was typing into the computer, they didn't want SPR to investigate, really. Here in this situation, it's quite the opposite. SPR kind of has free reign to set up recorders, cameras, and everything to try and document whatever is going on. Let's jump back to the voice phenomenon, right? With
Yeah. The
the claim
strongest
of,
case.
yeah, of Bill Wilkins. Within this case, they say, well, I would say one of the most chilling elements would be the disembodied voice of none other than Bill Wilkins. So the voice
Mhm.
claimed to be, like we said, Bill Wilkins, a man who died in the house years earlier from a brain hemorrhage in a chair in the living room, and this voice spoke through Janet. The kicker here is that when they researched and did investigation, they confirmed that a man by the name Bill Wilkins had indeed lived and died in the house in the same manner which the voice described. But skeptics point out that that's public information.
Yeah.
I mean, a fucking 11-year-old girl is going to go and look up public information on this guy that died and try to mimic his voice.
Yeah. So I mean, really, in that case, if you're arguing that this is a situation in which there's fabrication, I think that the parents would have to have been involved. Some kind of coaching would have had to have gone on, and on like I'm just going to be completely out there and honest with everybody listening. Like looking at the pictures of the girl quote unquote hovering above her bed. She is fucking jumping. I don't give a shit. I don't give two. Like, listen, like she might believe, like, okay, so they're, young kids, they are very open to suggestion and all that. Like, that's just their brain is so malleable, which in situations in which you want to progress the child brain, like that's great. Like malleable's great. Like you teach them great shit. But if you were gonna sit there and like inundate them with this idea that there was some deity or some evil spirit that was orchestrating their demise, like of course they're gonna do stuff like this. Like that's just the normal quintessential human brain at that age. There's no fault or no blame that I'm aiming towards the poor girl who went through this. But looking at her photos, the activation, like I know enough about anatomy to where I'm looking at her body and I'm looking at the position of her hair as she's quote unquote hovering above her bed. These are clearly photos where somebody is activating their normal muscular strength to elevate themselves in the air because of physics, because of her muscle activation in her legs, the position of her arms. Like there's not one photo that I see in all of these photos that would suggest she's actually hovering against her will. I could be completely fucking wrong. I could be completely off in the situation, but this is just based off of what I see and what I know about human anatomy and physics and stuff. I wouldn't blame a child for acting this way, but at the same time, I know, like, as we talked about, there were some weird recordings where she lowered her voice to an octave that is not supposed to be possible for a child at her age. I don't really know what kind of fabrication could have happened in the 70s for that kind of voice manipulation, but all I know is like what I've seen in terms of photographs and jumping and hovering, that just seems to me like less credible. What I think is more important to focus on in this case are two factors. The police officers reporting things flying across the room, and they don't have any equities in what's going on in the situation in the beginning. And two, this poor girl talking in several octaves below her voice box capability in the 1970s. I don't know what kind of manipulation could have been going on in terms of recording back then for that, but it's certainly creepy enough to pay attention to.
To put a nail in this coffin, Janet was caught on video a few times, bending spoons, attempting to bend an iron bar,
trying to showcase their capabilities. Right.
Yeah.
Like, why would you do that? Like, why, if you were under such duress and pain, like who would give a fuck whether or not you could bend spoons? Like, no, you're being attacked by a malicious psychological, like, whatever source or whatever. Like why would you care whether or not people believed you bending spoons?
Right. And on top of that, they've admitted, like the kids admitted, that they faked a few things to see if the investigators would notice, but she maintained that 98% of what happened was real. They claim that they pranked the journalists that were involved. So this is where it gets kind of murky, because on the one hand, they're saying that, yeah, some of it we kind of fabricated because it was kids being fucking kids. But at the same time, they're trying to say, like, we kind of did some stuff to goof around, but some stuff really was going on. Yeah.
Yeah,
You know what
that
makes
just
it what makes it interesting is that I believe Janet herself, shortly after the incident, like in the years following that incident, she actually spent time in a psychiatric hospital,
yeah.
and she claims that she's still affected by what was going on in that house. But this one, dude, like you said, there are a couple things with this situation where it's like, okay, you have the police report, you have the mom seeing shit. The mom is like, fuck, let me call the police. Maybe they can help. They can't help. Let me call the media. Maybe they can help. They can't help. That shit spreads like wildfire. SPR gets involved. They want to try to help. Then you have the kids being little shits, even though they may be experiencing things. They're like, okay, there are people around here, kids being kids, they're going to want attention, right? Maybe they kind of fabricated things.
Yeah.
So the funniest thing that I found, like that a skeptic suggests with the Bill Wilkins voice, that Janet was using some form of ventriloquism to produce the voice. I mean, you're talking about a fucking 11-year-old girl. Like, come on,
Yeah,
people.
that's really
Let's not,
hard to justify,
yeah,
yeah, or
let's,
explain.
yeah, let's not do that shit.
I think that there's some more to explore here, which is what we're going to do. But you brought up an interesting point, which is just I want the listeners to put themselves in a situation hypothetically for a second here. Like, let's say that you are growing up in, if anything, borderline poverty, like if not just middle class, but like you don't have a lot of promise or hope to escape your current financial situation, right? Let's say hypothetically that you are a rational person who is looking for opportunities to escape your current financial situation, right? And you might not be immoral enough to completely fabricate some kind of lie. Like you and I, anybody who's listening to this, of course we can fucking come up with whatever situation we wanted to as a lie. We can even lie on our taxes and say like, no, the government owes me $20,000 because of XYZ. You could try that. Like you could try to be immoral and try to do something like that. You might get caught, you might not. But initially, I think most people would not be motivated or risk that much to try to get that amount to shore up their lives or whatever, right? So take that for what it is and apply it to this situation. There's a lot of uncertainty at the poverty, the poor level and the middle class level. So put a pin in that. What if you, knowing that, had a situation you're experiencing in your personal life where like, oh, there is something unexplainable going on. Like there's something strange happening in my house to my children, even if it's intermittent. You can say like, well, okay, well, I don't see any immediate danger. I don't see any sign that these experiences are going to hurt me and my family. And there, like you said, Chris, there's like people swarming us. There's news vans. There's people coming to investigate all this stuff. Maybe this is an opportunity. So to elevate ourselves out of our current situation. I think it's a mistake to automatically assume based off of the situations we see in this case where it's like, okay, they could have fabricated everything or part of it. I think they fabricated part of it. My best guess. At the same time, I have to maintain a degree of uncertainty because of some of the situations that don't seem explainable. So maybe it really is a case in which, like I'm sorry, like it's a shit ton of working up to what I'm saying, but like everything I said working up to this idea that maybe the situation they found themselves in, it's like, well, we have some like paranormal stuff going on that we can't explain. We can't do anything about it. It's not hurting us, like it's not threatening our lives. So maybe we should just go along with it and fuck whatever paranormal entity that's trying to scare us. Like, we're going to turn this into a positive.
Right.
So maybe they did coax the kids into doing something beyond the paranormal, what they were going on, but it did start with that paranormal. That I think that's totally within the realm of possibility. And I know it's hard to prove, but just for the sake of conversation, why not bring it up?
Right. No, I completely agree. I think that's a very important factor. And the last thing I'll say on this is I'll give you some pros and some cons. Some things
Yep.
to make it believable and some things to bring it on the skeptical side. And then maybe we can let the listeners decide. In favor of believing this story, We have over 30 independent witnesses, including family members, neighbors, police, journalists, paranormal researchers that claim to have heard or seen inexplicable phenomenon. These events took place over 18 months. There was audio, photographic, and written documentation, as well as testimonies from respected figures such as police officers. We have the voice phenomenon of Bill Wilkins, which they were able to prove that Bill Wilkins did live there and did die there. On the controversial side, there are several hallmarks of this being a hoax or a little bit of faking. So Janet herself admits decades later that she and her sister faked a small part of the activity to test the investigators. You will have skeptics like yourself, Dean, that argued that the strange photograph of Janet levitating actually depicts her in mid jump. Also, the claim that the deep voice that she used might be a result of clever trickery, like you just pointed out, the family being under immense psychological and financial stress might have unconsciously staged or consciously staged some events for attention, and the involvement of tabloid media heightened the drama and pressured everyone to produce sensational evidence because this is now all over the media. The worst thing you want to do is look like a fool in the media. Both Janet and Margaret claim that their events were genuine. Janet is quoted as saying, I'll paraphrase here, I don't care whether people believe me, but I know what happened and it was real. But they both maintain that they occasionally played tricks, but that the overwhelming majority of the phenomenon were beyond their control. So I think
Yeah, please
my
go ahead.
final thoughts on this is that there was a little bit of both,
Yeah.
especially with what the police saw, with what some of the evidence that SPR captured. But I also think these kids were being kids and they were full of shit and they muddied the waters with their behavior and faking some stuff.
Here's the funny thing about human life or experience that we're going through in this particular time period. And when I say time period, I mean like modern humanity, right? Like we're not living in the bush for the most part. We're not trying to survive. Like we're not talking about shaman, like which is one of the earliest religions in human history, where we're trying to make sense of our reality based off of the unknown, which is potentially the spiritual, the cosmic, whatever. Let's just focus specifically on the modern age where we have various religions, various perspectives, but we at the same time, even though we're not in the state of nature where we're like facing death and destruction in terms of like, you know, tribe A coming to wipe out us out, tribe B or whatever, like we're still facing the situation in which like we need money and support and all that stuff to survive in the present day. And that was true back in the 70s, right? We're going through our own shit now, which is, you know, a lot of economic uncertainty, political uncertainty, all that junk. I think it was pretty much the same in terms of direct translation of like conceptual translation to what they were dealing with in the 70s. You know, you had the Cold War that was, you know, at the forefront of everyone's mind, like nuclear annihilation. Like nobody knew what was going to happen. At the same time, as we mentioned in the beginning, you had economic uncertainty. If you were the middle class across the globe, like you worked your fucking ass off to try to give your family the best possible situation. The whole reason we talk about this podcast is that when we bring stuff up, there's no certainty whether or not paranormal or cryptid encounters are real, UFO encounters are real. But what matters is they could be real regardless of the situation, that like whatever human experience that we're talking about, like, you know, whether it's the 70s, the 80s, 90s, like, you know, even 1,000 years ago, like what matters is like there's a possibility that these things happened. And to tie it back into the Enfield case, like we said before, we could have very much had a situation where like these kids, these poor kids are going through this unexplainable situation that might be paranormal. They can't do anything about it, but their parents are like, well, fuck, like we can't prove it. Like we can't for sure say that our kids are going through this or not. They could be making it up because they're kids. But at the same time, hey, you know, regardless of whether or not these entities are going after our kids, they're not killing them. They're not physically threatening them. So maybe we could turn this into a situation in which we can get some relief out of it because of their financial situation, because of everything I said before, like uncertainty, political, financial, all that stuff. My best guess is that you had adults who needed or felt like they needed some kind of financial assistance out of the situation. And they're like, hey, let's just give a little bit more to this situation to make sure, like, we know that there's something strange going on. Let's add a little bit more to it to make sure we protect our family and get them out of the situation where it's like middle class bordering on like, low class, all that stuff. I think that's the most reasonable explanation, especially given like the fact that there were the voice alterations that were unexplainable, the police interactions that said like, oh shit was flying across the room in this at the same time where we're like seeing photos of the little girls like jumping out of their bed and stuff. Like, it just doesn't make total sense. But at the same time, I think that there's some wiggle room, if that makes sense.
No, it completely does make sense. And I think I'm in the same camp as you. There's some things that you can't just take as fact. Some of it, you can clearly tell that it's hoaxed. But like you said, there's some wiggle room based on the previous evidence that we discussed earlier in the episode. But I will kick it to the listeners. What do you guys think? Based off of everything that we discussed, do you think this was legitimate? Do you think this was completely hoaxed? Or the truth is something in between? Thanks for tuning into today's episode of The Wandering Road. You can find us on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most podcast platforms. Be sure to subscribe and share. Also, don't forget to give a follow on Instagram at twroadpodcast and follow my TikTok at twrpodcast. Take care, and I'll catch you on the next one.